here's our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. We begin today's program in Brasilia, where BRICS state leaders are gathering for the 11th summit. This year's meeting is seen to usher in a second golden decade for more cooperation among the 5 emerging markets. BRICS members are expected to reaffirm support for multilateralism and partnerships. Earlier, I talked to our panelists about that, but before we get to that debate, take a look at this backgrounder with the latest information first.
Embracing the second golden decade. After the past years, the emerging market bloc, BRICS, has grown into a major force in the global economy and a voice in international affairs. In 2018, BRICS accounted for about 24% of the world GDP and 16% of global trade.
So we are going to make some comments about strengthening and reforming multilateralism. It includes the UN, the IMF, the Security Council, the WTO. We are also going to make comments about our economic and financial cooperation in several areas.
And this year, the focus is on an innovative future. At last year's summit in South Africa, BRICS nations agreed to build a partnership for a new industrial revolution, tapping into the potential of areas such as the digital economy and smart manufacturing. BRICS leaders gather amid uncertainties with rising unilateralism and trade protectionism. These have sent jitters over currents of profound changes around the world.
We, BRIC countries, we are going to send out a strong message to the international community that we are defending strongly the multilateral system, a more open, free, fair international trade system. So I think that will be a very strong message this summit will deliver to the international community.
After the abrupt cancellation of the APEC summit in Chile, the BRICS summit has become a more essential platform for multilateralism. BRICS nations have to carry the torch of free trade. All eyes are on how far these countries will work together in pushing for their common agenda in the international arena.
For more on the BRICS summit, we have in Las Vegas Charles Tang, president of the Brazil-China Chamber of Commerce and Industry. In Moscow, we are joined by Alexander Lukin, director of the East Asian and SCO Studies at the Moscow State Institute of International Relations. Last but not least, in Beijing, Liu Baocheng, dean of the Center for International Business Ethics from University of International Business and Economics. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. This year's BRICS summit apparently has more significance than it used to be. Particularly now, there's a great juncture of change. Mr. Tang, how do you see that?
Because of the world multipolar and isolationist movement, I think that the BRICS summit will be very, very important to discuss all these complex worldwide issues. And the BRICS are advancing a lot because from an acronym invented by Jim O'Neill, it has become a major movement. And together, they formed the new development bank, which is helping a lot of the worldwide countries to finance their infrastructure development.
Yeah.
And the new BRICS Development Bank knows the needs of the emerging nations.
Will financial cooperation, Professor Lukin, one of the key areas this time for the BRICS summit?
It is one of the important things which is usually discussed and will be discussed this time. But I don't think that BRICS is an economic group or organization. The main idea of the BRICS is more geopolitical, and BRICS is more about also changing the system of global governance. The bilateral cooperation between the member states is an important but not the most important thing the BRICS is discussing. So BRICS emerged from the, I would say, dissatisfaction of some major non-Western states and centers of power with their role in the kind of Western-dominated system of global governments. So BRICS, I would say, represents the voice of non-Western world, or if we use the phrase "the West and the rest," it represents the rest in global government system, and that's why its main goal is to change, without undermining it significantly, to change the entire system of global governments so that non-Western world should have more say. The financial system and the BRICS Bank should be seen from that angle, that this is kind of, well, it's not a complete alternative to existing system, to say World Bank or International Monetary Fund, but it gives some kind of more option for countries to in the financial area.
Professor Liu, now two things: whether global governance is likely to be thoroughly and effectively discussed, and whether the consensus among the BRICS economies will be able to bring more certainties to global governance. That probably is a big question mark.
That's true. Yes, the BRICS Summit was really created to challenge and review the existing global order together with governance, particularly in the financial sector. And it is there to also to fill the gap of deficiency provided by existing global financial institutions. And in the meantime, the BRICS economy also represents the emerging economies. Now they are able to cluster together with a common platform to, if not really to change, but rather to contribute to the betterment of the global financial governance and institution, and also the deficiency in supporting infrastructure development in the member states, and also the other developing economies to work towards the sustainable development goals sanctioned by the United Nations.
Of course, you know, the bigger concept are very much bigger aspirations, but what about details? Mr. Tang, for example, some of the BRICS economies have been increasingly enthusiastic about finding alternatives to the SWIFT system. Now we all know the SWIFT system has a lot to do with the dominance of the US dollar. So some of these economies already finding their alternatives. What does that mean for the BRICS finding their own ways forward despite of the turbulence?
I think that it has very much to do with what we were talking about finding alternative governance and finding alternative financial system, because since Bretton Woods, the world global financial system has been controlled by the largest debtor nations of the world, except for Germany, and creditor nations like China and the BRICS countries did not have much of a voice. You know, why does the World Bank and IMF always have to have an American and European president? Why not a Chinese president? Why not a Russian president? So the same thing goes for SWIFT. SWIFT is a system where United States has total control over, and it can be used, and it has been in the past, for, let's say, political reasons. And to, you know, when you have isolate countries' financial system, you can use that. So I think that it would be very important for the BRICS countries to have their own system if they can do it.
The dominance of the US dollar, of course, is a big subject. Whether Libra will be adopted, when you hear the House hearing, very much is about the dominance of the US dollar, whether that will be undermined or not. But Professor Liu, we're not talking about US dollar, we're talking about whether the alternatives the BRICS economies find in terms of, for example, the SWIFT system would set a precedence about how these economies are likely to solve some of the problems as a result of a Western, what they consider dominated international governance system. How much that will change, the question really is.
I think one is that it brings up a showcase to focus on infrastructure development and clean energy and transportation, etc.
Yeah, but you know, my question really is, when you adopt an alternative to the SWIFT system, it is certainly bringing some kinds of hope that there will be more equal opportunities among economies. But the question really is, how sustainable will that be? How welcome that will be? And also whether it will be a practice that eventually lead to certain results, or it's just experiment at a very small scale.
Well, it has really reduced reliance on the dominance of the U.S. dollar because the member states' currency can be there to denominate the value, and also over the recent years they also trying to raise local currency as deposit to support the infrastructure development and
currency swap as well.
Yes, and also currency swap. So it's a very useful trial, and particularly for the member states, you see that since the establishment, the share of global GDP has been increased among these members from 30% to 36%, which shows quite a remarkable success. And the fact that the bank, the new development bank, has really, over the past 5 years, has really contributed to more than 40 major projects in member states and also in neighboring states, which are really operated very successfully in a transparent manner.
I see.
So this is really an alternative to a showcase to some of the deficiencies the old established global institutions will have to benchmark on.
Well, the BRICS banks and also the alternative, obviously the BRICS economies are trying to look forward to the SWIFT system, be the starting point of real results that you see BRICS are going to make a difference. Professor Lukin.
BRICS can make a difference. The institutions such as New Bank, BRICS Bank, cannot completely, cannot be an absolute alternative to existing system, but it, as I said, it can give an option. So for countries which in a crisis or in a difficult situation can apply either to Western-dominated system banks or to BRICS Bank. And it will bring more competition in this field, and of course it's quite good for world economy. But also I would like to mention that we are talking only on BRICS or about BRICS Bank, but the bank is only a small part of what BRICS is doing as an organization. It has cooperation and proposals in many spheres, beginning from, say, anti-terrorist activities, they're discussing this, and to sports and education, for example. So I would say that BRICS is trying to present a non-Western alternative in many spheres, not only financial system. And this is very important because BRICS has become kind of, for example, within G20, BRICS is a group which represents non-Western interests. And this is very important because before that we had only G7 there, but now we have G7 on one pole and BRICS on the other pole.
I see.
You know, there was a time when Russia actually was part of both G8 and BRICS, but our Western friends did their best to push Russia out of the Western part of the world. So now Russia is definitely also a part of the rest, a part of the non-Western
That's
world.
why there are a lot of media reports suggesting, Professor Liu, that BRICS actually is more about geopolitics rather than just economic entity. What do you say?
Well, I would rather wish that the BRICS is more focused, because nowadays everyone is talking about big, broad questions, G20, APEC, even the WEF, the World Economic Forum. So, how can these, global institutions differentiate themselves by concentrating on something that they can really specialize and they can really create developmental impact. So that's something very important. For
Okay.
example, the Shanghai Cooperation focused more on initially on anti-terrorism and geopolitics, but then expanded to economics and to finance, etc. And now the BRICS Summit is there. I think it should be focused on how emerging economies can really find an alternative of governance, an alternative way of financing themselves, and be more practical.
I see. Mr. Tan, where do you stand in that debate?
Well, I think it's a very important geopolitical grouping, and especially, Chairman Xi Jinping's initiative to create a BRICS Plus will enlarge the grouping. And if you take BRICS Plus to BRICS Plus, it's a much larger, and in terms of GDP, in terms of population, geographical area, than the rich nations clubs. And, it's very important because the BRICS and the BRICS Plus understand the needs of the developing nations, which were not clearly and very attended to by the developed nations dominated world financial system and geopolitical dominance.
What about the
so
synergy?
I think it's a very important geopolitical grouping.
What about, when we talk about grouping, what about the synergy and also interactions among the economies in the BRICS? I mean, earlier, Mr. Tan, you know that Brazilian president visited China, and this is, of course, his important visit prior to Brazil hosting the BRICS Summit this time. So how do you see the synergy among the BRICS economies?
Well, President Bolsonaro's visit to China was very, very important. Once he became president, he realized the importance and the strategic alliance between the two giants of South America and of Asia. And his visit, he certainly liked his visit because, when he was in China, he announced that the Chinese do no longer need visa to go to Brazil. So that is a sign that he has been very pleased with what he saw. And before that, his son had been in China a few weeks before his visit, and certainly also had reported very favorably to his father.
I see.
And so I think that with this visit, the strategic alliance between the two giants will continue to grow.
What about the synergy from your perspective, Professor Lukin? Now, Russia has been quite active on the international stage recently, particularly with the latest development in the Middle East. So how is Russia look at the synergy among the BRICS countries and looking at its potential?
Well, BRICS is very important for Russia. I would say that BRICS actually grew out of Russian-Chinese cooperation. I remember in the 1990s, Mr. Primakov, who at that time was Russian Prime Minister, I think it was 96, when he said that there will be a close cooperation in the future between Russia, China, and India. Then other countries joined, Brazil and then South Africa, and but the core of it was still Russian-Chinese cooperation, I would say. And still Russia and China are the closest partners among all BRICS countries. The trade is growing and they're strategic partners, and they cooperate almost in every sphere, international sphere. About Brazil, it is, I agree that it's very important, because when President Bolsonaro was elected, people thought that Brazil was kind of anti-BRICS and might even leave the group. But it all changed because it turned out, as my colleagues rightly said, that that cooperation with China, China's investment is very important to Brazil. And but this is not the only thing, because Brazil is not because BRICS is not only about bilateral cooperation, but also there are, I would say, there are international problems and issues which big non-Western countries share. And basically what they want to do is to see the world more multipolar and less Western dominated. And this interest is still there regardless to who is in power.
Professor Liu, about that, now China has been encouraging and advocating among the BRICS countries about multilateralism, hope that it could be a platform to uphold multilateralism. But the question really is, how will developing an emerging economies be able to do that, and will others follow suit? That is the issue, Professor.
Yes. Well, these BRICS members, they have a common goal. The immediately is industrialization process, the development of infrastructure, clean energy, etc. But in the meantime, they also are really having still reliance on export market and technology input from with the developed world. And within themselves, actually, there is also competition and cooperation because they have similar industrial structure. And when China is really moving forward in industrial upgradation, hopefully there's going to be more synergy. But they are also competing on the same market and with partners. And they're also it's a really complex situation. They all want to reduce the reliance on the dominance of U.S. dollar and the governance of the old-fashioned Bretton Woods.
I see. For now, we want to thank the three of you gentlemen for joining us about the latest with the BRICS and what to expect. Charles Tang, Alexander Lukin, Liu Baocheng. Thank you so much. Welcome back. You're watching live edition of World Insight coming to you from Beijing. How can proper governance make a difference amid global uncertainty? We try to find an answer through a series starting from today. We will bring you a special series called Governance Makes a Difference, a chance to hear out some of the world's preeminent experts and scholars. They offer sensible and deep insights on matters across border. To start things off, meet Professor Paul Romer of New York University, who's a Nobel laureate in economics. He said, although the pursuit of proper governance might be a constant battle, we can make it happen, particularly now. Let's listen in. Professor Romer, what a pleasure to see you in Beijing.
Well, it's great to be here.
You have been recognized by the fact that you are advocating sharing of technology. But the challenges are? Because you've been advocating about the sharing, obviously there's a deficit of it. So what are the major challenges for the deficit of it?
One of my big concerns right now is that we need good governments to make sure that the market works well. My initial work was the market can discover things, but that requires a government that does its job as well. And I think one of the big impediments right now is that many governments around the world are facing a challenge, that citizens are critical of government, they don't support government, they think we need to get rid of government, and I think this is a real threat to our ability to sustain progress.
Do you think those are the problems? I mean, the governments are the problems, or they are not necessarily the root cause of things?
Well, the governments sometimes don't do their job very well, but the mistake is to say, well, then we're just going to get rid of government. We don't want to have it. What we need to do is make sure governments actually do their job, which is to encourage research, for example, to support universities, but also to make sure that everybody in a society has a chance to get a job that can expose them to the benefits of new technology and help them learn and earn a good living.
One of the things people discuss recently, very frequently, is who are likely to be the most important players in terms of pushing the evolution of societies. From your perspective, Professor Romer, what do you think?
One fact that stands out when you look across a long period of time is that the leader in one era will typically slow down and another country will take over. So if you look ahead 100 years, 200 years, who the new leaders will be could be different than who the leaders are today. This is part of the inevitable change, just like some firms are successful for a while and then less so afterwards.
But the transitional period of time is extremely challenging and dangerous, as you may know.
I think dangerous is maybe a little bit too strong. I think the world is still a much better place than it was a century ago or 2 centuries ago. But we have to be vigilant because there are real challenges ahead.
What are the things that we should be vigilant about?
I think, for example, the global warfare that we saw in the 20th century, I don't think that's the biggest threat now. I think that's a much smaller threat. But things like the financial crisis that we had in 2007 and 8, that's a risk that I think we're now exposed to. And this was very harmful to economies. I think it also helped breed this anger in many countries, which is disturbing political systems. So I think a big challenge for the leading governments right now is to make sure we don't have a repeat of this financial crisis.
Inequality within societies are some of the important issues for many countries.
Yeah.
However, some of the politicians tend to export the problem by pointing fingers to the others. I'm not talking about specific countries, just as a trend.
Sure.
And therefore, geopolitics becoming ever more intense. And this is feeding on one another, the two factors. So Professor Romer, as someone who won the Nobel Prize for a sharing of the best of the world, what do you make of this trend? Are politicians the problem or the solution?
I think government needs to do a better job. One of the best ways that governments have helped give everybody access to a good life is through investments in education. And I don't think, at least in my country and in the West, I don't think we've made the big new investments in better education in, say, the last 50 years that we made in the first half of the 20th century. So we've gotten complacent, and we need to redouble our efforts to give everybody the kind of education that will let them thrive.
What were the problems that the education are not shared, the resources of it? Is it because of commercialization? Is it because government trying to kick the responsibilities down the road? What is it?
Well, in the early 20th century in the United States, we made a commitment that everybody could go to high school and should go to high school. That was unusual at that time. Right now, we've got a system where for college, we don't commit that everybody should be able to go to college. And that's the kind of new commitment we need to make. And it could be a technical school, it could be the traditional university, but we need to keep extending these opportunities for education. The other thing that I think is very important is to remember that young people learn things on the job. And so we need to make sure that if young people aren't in school, they get access to jobs, and that they're expected to take jobs where they learn on the job. And they're not always the most attractive jobs, but these entry-level jobs are very important for people to acquire skills that they're used throughout their lifetime. So in many countries, these high rates of unemployment we see for young people, this is a red flag that something is wrong, and we need to make sure they get into productive activities.
Technologies were being tapped as a resource for sharing of the best of the world. Of course, also to give equal opportunities at the very beginning of it, at least. But Professor Romer, it did not turn out to be that way. Sometimes the technological gap is creating ever more problem in our society than less. So what do you make of your theory? I mean, back in 2018, but now...
Well, if you think of chemistry and petrochemicals, refining, has given us many benefits, but there were some things that were real harms. For example, in the 1970s, we learned that there was a chemical called the CFCs that was destroying the ozone layer. Now, at that time, governments acted. As soon as they found that, they said, we have to stop this, we're going to ban that chemical. We had international treaties, and we saved the ozone layer. Now, what's the analog of that today? Well, one, we don't have governments responding in the same way to global warming, and that should worry us. But also, we've seen some uses of technology that are harmful. We've seen firms that have figured out how to get people addicted to devices and to control what they do and to manipulate them. We should have a government which steps in and says, this is wrong. We're not going to let innovation be used to exploit people and used to just create wealth for a very few without creating benefits for everyone.
But if you look at some of the recent stories, Professor Romer, for example, Chile as a country has to suspend hosting APEC, which is never happened over the past almost 3 decades.
Right.
If you look at the governments that are trying to deal with chaos on the streets, on their home turf, if you look at governments that were struggling to come up with budget or to have anything done in the parliament, if you look at governments that try to, what Brexit or others, I wonder where is your confidence, Professor Romer, for governments?
I think first we have to diagnose what's causing the problems we're seeing. And there could be a couple of forces that are driving this. One that you alluded to earlier is inequality. And I think we haven't done a good job of making sure that everybody benefits from technology and trade. So governments, we know that in some countries, the governments do a good job of preserving equality, and others they don't. So the ones who don't need to do a better job. Now, I think the other thing that has caused a lot of the anger, the populism, the disaffection with government is this financial crisis of 2007 and 8. And so I think we have to be very careful not to let that happen again.
I am not naive, Professor Romer. I know Nobel Prize recipient would not even have solution for everything.
Okay.
But may I remind you that we are in a geopolitically complicated world these days, particularly between China and the United States, for example. The apparent trade war between the two largest economies not necessarily have already big impact on the global economy, but certain uncertainty, which lead to global economic problems. That is exactly feeding your worry, which is about the global financial crisis. Is technology, which is your subject, going to help in any way?
Well, I think we shouldn't think of technology as the miracle cure. That if we just have new innovations, new software, new hardware, new pharmaceuticals, those alone will not generate progress. To make progress, we have to have governments that can do their job. We have to agree what their job is, and then we have to hold the government accountable and make sure it does the job. And we've had a period here of the last several decades where economists have frankly not been helpful on this because we've often said just get the government out of the way. And we need to focus again on the important things that government can and should do and then make sure that government does that.
What are those important things?
Well, so access to education, a sense that everyone has a stake in the benefits from growth. I think also protecting the environment and protecting people from firms that can be very aggressive, even predatory in their approach to making
But this
profit.
is common sense, isn't it?
Yeah.
Professor, it was once believed that common sense, that's what the government should do. That's why they exist. But how come common sense now becomes a rare item?
Yeah, well, it's kind of like, it's a constant battle. You never can get complacent. I think we got complacent in many countries. And we also, in both the left and the right, started accepting this idea that the market can do everything. And it's just not true.
But it's also important who is in the government.
Yes.
Who are the decision makers?
Yeah.
Are they equipped with the skills, or are they pure politicians?
But again, that's a choice. If we pay government workers well, if we promote the most talented workers, we could have very skilled people in government. And the decisions we're asking the government to make are very complicated, increasingly technical, scientific engineering questions. So we need to be sure that we can attract very good people, both talented and of high integrity, into our governments around the world.
It is a fact, and probably an unpleasant fact, that more and more people these days do not want to believe in institutions.
Yeah.
So, Professor, do you think there's a quick fix? Because we better fix it quickly.
I don't think it's a quick fix. And I think it's the job of people who are in public life, like economists and academics. It's our job to get the message out. And I don't think we've been doing that job very well. Economists bear a special responsibility here because we were so forceful in defending the market. We were so enthusiastic about the market that we tipped the balance. So we as a discipline, as a profession, need to right that balance and put more emphasis on the role of the government.
What about the other things, since you talk about technology? There is a danger, some suggest, as a result of geopolitics, or the way to innovate. There could be decoupling of certain kinds of innovative and technological cooperation in the world. China and the US could be one of those examples, but there could be other examples as well. Professor, are you concerned about that?
Let me give you an example. Somebody might have said, the Europeans are starting to build their own airplane company. So they're going to decouple from trade in the US firms with Boeing and Douglas who make airplanes, and this is a bad thing. In fact, the world is better off that we have Airbus that's making airplanes and not just American firms that have collapsed into a single firm, Boeing. So you could have called that decoupling, but you could also call it resilience. We now have, and you could call it competition, which is what economists believe in. It's okay if there's competing standards, competing, ways to do things. And it's actually kind of risky to overinvest in just one solution. For example, in servers, these machines in the cloud that we always connect up with, almost all of those servers run on one particular type of operating system. It's this open source Linux system. If something goes wrong with that ecosystem, the whole server ecosystem is at risk. The same thing is true of the hardware chipsets. There's one instruction set that is used by Intel and then AMD to run all the chips that run all these servers. It might be better for the world as a whole if there were more competing suppliers of the hardware. We shouldn't let those national rivalries get in the way of parallel systems and competition between those different systems. One of the biggest concerns that economists have right now is that we're not seeing enough competition. We're seeing too many firms that are too powerful, and it's competition that pushes us to do better, that forces innovation, that's really the driver of progress.
Some people are already very skeptical about what can be achieved worldwide. I wonder from you, after a long sigh, which I just noticed, can we hope much?
We can. When I was a graduate student in the late 1970s, it was a period of deep pessimism, especially in the West. The world looked kind of bleak. We saw problems with pollution, we started to see inflation rising, and there was great pessimism at that time.
And Cold War too.
Yeah, right, the Cold War, the threat of nuclear war. And I started working on growth by looking at history and saying, over time, things have really gotten better. We live longer. We have more opportunities to pursue careers that we find fulfilling. Women who for centuries were treated with much less equality,
respect,
had more opportunities. So if you look over the long sweep of history, there's a direction of progress that has been taking place, and there's no reason to think, like people thought in the 70s, oh, we're finally reached the end. Progress is going to stop. It wasn't true then. I don't think it's true now. I think if we work hard, progress will still come. But it's not something that will just happen if we just sit around and act complacent. It will happen if we make it happen. In English, we say, you make progress. We just have to work harder and make it.
Professor Romer, what a pleasure.
Thank
you so much for sharing our time. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure, too.
Thank you, Professor.